Movies show the Wild West as dusty streets, brave cowboys, and heroic gunfights. They almost never show the smell. Real frontier towns were soaked in horse manure, chewing tobacco spit, shared beds, reused medical bandages, and drinking water that might have passed through an outhouse first. In this video, we are exposing 44 disgusting realities of daily life in a Wild West town that history books and Western movies politely skip. 1. Stepping into a local saloon was less about enjoying a cold drink and more about entering a full-scale biological hazard zone with piano music. The floors were usually coated in a thick, sticky layer of stale beer, mud, and endless streams of chewing tobacco spit. Sure, they had brass spittoons, but plenty of cowboys treated them like vague suggestions, so you were constantly walking across a wet, brown carpet of human saliva. And the whiskey was no sacred beverage either. In rougher places, barkeeps might stretch bad liquor with pepper, tobacco, or other foul additives that made every sip feel like a dare. You were paying good money to drink suspicious firewater while standing ankle-deep in stranger spit. 2. Everyone thinks of pioneers as rugged survivors who could easily patch up a wound with a torn bandana, but their actual first aid methods were deeply nauseating. Because professional medical supplies were practically non-existent on a remote homestead, mothers frequently relied on free, abundant materials to treat everyday injuries. If a ranch hand suffered a bad scrape or a severe insect sting, the standard frontier remedy was to immediately apply a thick, warm poultice of fresh cow manure directly onto the open skin. Instead of preventing infection, this incredibly misguided attempt at healing actively introduced a terrifying amount of farmyard bacteria right into the bloodstream. 3. Ordering a cold drink with actual ice during a sweltering August afternoon was a supreme status symbol that masked a deeply unsanitary secret. Ice was an absolute luxury commodity harvested during the freezing winters and stored underground in sawdust for months. However, this premium ice was typically sawed straight out of the exact same local rivers where the entire town dumped their raw sewage and slaughterhouse waste all year long. When that expensive chunk of frozen river water finally melted into your 5-cent glass of lemonade, it released a concentrated, foul-tasting cloud of winter garbage right into your beverage, turning a refreshing treat into a bacterial nightmare. 4. High society ladies stepping off the stagecoach in vibrant emerald green gowns always looked dazzling on screen, but that fabulous color sometimes came with a deeply ugly secret. To achieve that wildly fashionable bright green shade, many 19th century dressmakers relied on dyes that contained arsenic compounds. A fancy ball gown could cost a staggering $40, making it the kind of prized possession a woman wore again and again. But as the fabric rubbed against sweaty skin and tiny particles drifted loose into the air, those glamorous dresses could become a slow, miserable health hazard. Fashion was not just expensive, it was occasionally toxic. Looking rich could leave you with headaches, nausea, and the cheerful realization that your outfit might be trying to kill you. 5. Saturday night bath time at the local bathhouse was an absolute nightmare for anyone who had the wildly unreasonable dream of coming out cleaner. Water was brutally heavy to haul and expensive to heat, so a proprietor might fill a single copper tub and charge the highest price to the first man through the door. By the time several more customers had taken their turn, that water was no longer remotely fresh. It had become a lukewarm, cloudy stew of dead skin, muddy boot dirt, dried sweat, and whatever else the frontier had glued onto human bodies that week. You were essentially paying hard-earned cash to marinate in the collective body odor of half the town. By the end, the bath felt less like hygiene and more like soup with a hat rack nearby. 6. We all recognize the iconic cinematic image of a solitary tumbleweed gently rolling past a saloon before a big duel. But nobody mentions that these weeds were actually a massive, prickly menace. Introduced by accident in the 1870s, these invasive plants grew to the size of small wagons and blew across the plains in gigantic, thorny swarms. During a heavy windstorm, hundreds of them would pile up against the side of a wooden house, completely blocking the doors and trapping the furious residents inside. Even worse, they swept up all the dried horse manure and garbage from the streets as they rolled. delivering a giant ball of biological waste right to your front porch. 7. Getting a haircut or a shave was basically a game of frontier roulette, where the prize was maybe not dying of an infection. The town barber was often much more than a guy with scissors. In smaller places, he might also pull teeth, lance boils, dress wounds, or handle minor medical chores when no proper doctor was around. That meant the same hands and tools hovering near your face had probably been involved in something far more horrifying earlier that day. Germ theory was not exactly running the show, so a razor might get a quick wipe on a rag and then head straight for your neck. If you came in with a toothache, you might leave with a gap in your mouth, blood on your shirt, and a renewed appreciation for staying home. 8. Just crossing the main street was essentially an extreme sport with a strong chance of ending in public humiliation and something foul on your face. Wild West towns did not pave their roads, so rain turned the whole main drag into a churned swamp of mud, kitchen slop, wagon ruts, and towering amounts of horse manure. One bad step and you were sliding into a soup that smelled like a barn lost a legal battle. Losing your balance meant ruining your clothes, your dignity, and possibly your entire afternoon. Ladies even wore special raised overshoes to lift their hems above the muck, basically clomping around town on tiny wooden stilts just to buy flour without dressing like they had wrestled a cow. 9. Dealing with a massive bedbug infestation required a pest control method that was infinitely more dangerous than the actual insects. Without modern chemical sprays, desperate homesteaders turned to the cheapest, most flammable liquid they could find, which was coal oil or kerosene. A small bottle cost around 15 cents, and families would literally drench their wooden bed frames, mattresses, and floorboards in this highly combustible fuel just to kill the biting pests. Going to sleep meant lying down on a mattress soaked in explosive chemicals, right inside a tiny wooden cabin lit only by open-flame lanterns and a roaring fireplace. It was an incredibly reckless gamble where trying to stop an itch could easily result in burning the entire house to the ground. 10. Baking a fresh loaf of frontier bread in the cinema always features pristine white flour, but the reality of a pioneer pantry was basically a mandatory insect integration program. Buying a barrel of flour was a massive financial investment that had to last a family for 6 entire months, meaning you could not just throw it away when it inevitably became infested. Tiny flour weevils and fat white grubs were so common that cooks simply stopped trying to pick them out and just baked them directly into the biscuits. Every warm, buttery roll came with a highly disturbing, unexpected crunch, providing a completely free but entirely unwanted source of extra protein. 11. Booking a hotel room meant surrendering every last illusion you had about privacy, comfort, and basic human boundaries. In plenty of rough frontier inns, you did not get a room to yourself, and sometimes you did not even get a bed to yourself. Innkeepers packed travelers together wherever they could fit them, because empty mattress space was about as welcome as unpaid rent. You might end up under a filthy wool blanket beside 2 or 3 total strangers who had been sweating on the trail, coughing in the dust, and marinating in the same clothes for weeks. One guy smelled like sour milk, another like wet leather and horse, and all of you were breathing the same stale air. You paid for sleep and got an involuntary group project in misery. 12. Riding the newly built transcontinental railroad was supposed to be the peak of modern civilization, but nature had a disgusting way of reminding everyone who was really in charge. Massive swarms of locusts and grasshoppers could descend on whole regions in writhing, clicking waves that covered the land for miles. When a heavy locomotive pushed through those swarms, the sheer volume of crushed insects sometimes turned stretches of track slick enough to cause real trouble. Railroad crews might have to stop and clear the rails while passengers sat there breathing hot air filled with the smell of steam, grease, and freshly obliterated bug guts. So even on the proud machine that symbolized progress, you could still wind up delayed by a mountain of insect slime. The future smelled absolutely terrible. 13. You watch classic Western films and see dashing gunslingers walking into town wearing crisp white button-down shirts. But the historical truth is completely revolting. Doing laundry on the frontier was so brutally exhausting, and heavily priced that most cowboys simply wore the exact same woolen long underwear from October to April without a single wash. Soap was made from harsh animal fat and wood ash that would peel the skin off a person's hands, and paying a laundress could cost half a month's wages. Instead of paying up, men just let their clothes absorb 6 months of horse sweat, trail dust, and campfire smoke until the fabric practically stood up by itself in the corner of the room. 14. Grabbing a refreshing glass of milk at the general store sounds entirely wholesome, but it was actually one of the most reckless gambles you could take with your stomach. Before pasteurization, raw milk was completely unregulated and often heavily diluted with whatever contaminated river water the farmer could find, just to stretch his profits. A gallon of safe, clean water might be scarce, but a cheap glass of milk cost only a few pennies, and came with a complimentary dose of cow hair, manure flakes, and severe bacteria. Thirst was a serious financial calculation where the absolute cheapest beverage was basically liquid sabotage that kept everyone running to the outhouse. 15. If you imagine rugged frontiersmen flashing charming smiles after a long day of riding, frontier dental hygiene was actually a full carnival of horrors powered by money, neglect, and bad decisions. A decent toothbrush shipped in from the East Coast could feel like a luxury item in a place where families were counting every cent. Because of that, people made do with whatever they had for far too long, and personal grooming tools were not always as personal as the word suggests. In crowded homes or rough lodging houses, wash basin setups could become disturbingly communal, with brushes, cups, and towels shared far more freely than any sane person today would tolerate. So when you scrubbed your gums, there was always a decent chance you were also participating in somebody else's breakfast memories. 16. Picture the classic town well in the center of the square where neighbors gathered to chat. But the reality was a terrifying game of subterranean roulette. Because digging a deep, safe well cost upwards of $50, a massive fortune for a homesteader, people dug shallow holes as close to their back door as possible. Unfortunately, they also dug their outhouses just a few yards away to save time. When the heavy spring rains arrived, the overflowing latrines filtered directly down into the local drinking supply. Instead of refreshing spring water, the entire family was unknowingly chugging a highly concentrated fecal soup that turned a simple glass of water into a lethal dose of typhoid fever. 17. The fabulous corsets and heavy velvet dresses worn by wealthy townswomen look incredibly glamorous on the silver screen, but the smell trapped underneath those garments was downright aggressive. A proper tailored dress was a massive financial investment that could cost $20 or more, and the delicate fabrics absolutely could not be scrubbed in a harsh frontier wash tub. To protect these expensive garments from their own bodies, women wore thin cotton layers underneath, but they still sweat heavily while walking down unshaded, 90-degree boardwalks. Taking off those layers at night unleashed a suffocating wave of trapped body odor that had been heavily marinating inside a tight whalebone cage for 14 hours. 18. Trying to eat a peaceful meal meant doing constant battle with a literal black cloud of aggressive flies. Because towns were surrounded by livestock and open garbage pits, millions of buzzing insects considered the local dining hall their personal buffet. When a waiter set down a plate of beans and biscuits, you had to wave your hands like a windmill just to take a bite before the flies claimed it as their own territory. Stores even sold sticky paper to catch them, but it usually ended up dangling from the ceiling, heavily coated in dead bugs right above your head while you tried to enjoy a bowl of stew. 19. Seeing a wise frontier doctor squinting through perfectly fitted spectacles is a total Hollywood upgrade to a much messier reality. Custom optical lenses cost serious money, and many people with failing eyesight were not marching off to a trained specialist for a polished fitting. They were improvising. General stores and secondhand dealers often sold cheap spectacles in assorted strengths, and customers would simply try pairs on until the world looked slightly less blurry. That meant smudged frames, scratched lenses, and plenty of used glasses passing from face to face with very little concern for hygiene. It was practical, affordable, and exactly as gross as it sounds. Nothing says frontier medicine quite like solving your vision problem by jamming a stranger's old nose prints directly onto your own face. 20. We often picture tough lawmen patrolling a neat, dusty main street, but the actual sanitation plan in many frontier towns was closer to organized chaos with hooves. Because setting up proper garbage collection cost tax money that nobody was excited to spend, people often dumped food scraps, spoiled produce, and butcher waste wherever it was most convenient. To keep the town from disappearing under its own trash, pigs were sometimes allowed to roam around and clean up the mess the cheap way. Which sounds efficient until you realize that means large, aggressive hogs were wandering the streets treating public space like an all-you-can-eat buffet. You were not just stepping around manure on your walk to the bank. You were negotiating right-of-way with a furious, garbage-powered pig. 21. Wiping your face at the local tavern involved a communal roller towel that deserves its own entry in the Hall of Fame for shared frontier filth. Hanging next to the wash basin was a single, endless loop of fabric meant to serve every patron who wandered in needing to dry their hands, mop their brow, or erase half a lunch from their mustache. By noon, that towel was already streaked with tobacco juice, coal dust, axle grease, and the mysterious residue of 100 questionable life choices. You would tug the loop hoping to uncover one clean stretch, only to discover the entire thing had already been promoted to town sponge. Drying off was basically a ceremonial act of giving up and rubbing your face with the biography of everyone who came before you. 22. Chewing your food often came with a deeply unpleasant crunch, because nearly everything on the frontier was coated in a fine, determined layer of prairie dust. The wooden buildings had cracks everywhere, and the constant wind treated every kitchen like an open invitation. Street dirt, fireplace ash, and dried bits of livestock waste drifted straight through doors, windows, and gaps in the walls until they settled onto whatever was for supper. If you ordered pie, bread, or a plate of beans, there was a very real chance it came lightly seasoned with the landscape itself. Cooks could cover dishes with cloth, but the breeze always found a way to contribute. Every meal arrived with local flavor in the worst possible sense of the phrase. 23. You might imagine pioneers drifting off to sleep on soft feather beds after a long day of taming the wild frontier, but the reality of a frontier mattress would leave you begging for the floor. Real feathers were scarce and costly, so the vast majority of people slept on coarse sacks tightly stuffed with dried corn husks or prickly prairie grass. Every time you shifted your weight, the bed would crunch incredibly loudly, sounding like you were wrestling a giant pile of dry autumn leaves in the dark. Worse still, these husks were prime real estate for field mice, meaning your pillow frequently squirmed and squeaked right back at you while you tried to rest. 24. Walking into a frontier apothecary for some medicine sounds respectable enough, but 19th century drugstores often sold bottles that were basically expensive liquid bad decisions. A proper doctor could charge more than many people wanted or were able to pay, so cowboys and settlers leaned hard on cheap patent medicines with dramatic names and miracle claims. These tonics promised to cure coughs, pain, nerves, stomach trouble, and probably your ruined love life too. What they frequently delivered was a wild chemical cocktail of raw alcohol, opiates, sedatives, and other ingredients nobody bothered to explain honestly. You were not buying healthcare so much as spinning a roulette wheel in bottle form. One swallow might calm your cough. 3 more, and you were discussing theology with the wallpaper. 25. Riding the early rails as a paying passenger sounds polished and civilized in old advertisements, but staying hydrated on a frontier train could feel like joining a mobile germ festival. A train ticket cost real money, yet some rail cars still handled drinking water with all the sanitary elegance of a livestock trough. Instead of individual cups, there was often a single tin dipper or metal cup chained to the communal water barrel at the back of the car. Every coughing, sweating passenger reached for that same rim, from the banker in polished boots to the prospector who had not seen soap since winter. You paid top dollar for speed and comfort, then took turns kissing the exact same piece of metal as 40 strangers. Nothing says progress like high-speed shared saliva. 26. Styling your hair for a Saturday night barn dance involved smearing your head with substances that strictly belonged in a frying pan, not on a human scalp. Because manufactured styling products were highly expensive and incredibly rare, local cowboys and townspeople used rendered bear grease or leftover bacon fat to achieve that slicked-back look. While it certainly held your hair in place, walking around with raw animal fat on your head under a baking afternoon sun meant the grease quickly turned rancid. By mid-afternoon, the local bank teller smelled exactly like a rotting carcass, and his shiny hairstyle acted as a magnetic landing pad for every single horsefly in the territory. 27. Ordering a shot at the local watering hole sounds like a classic adventure, but real frontier glassware was a ridiculously expensive luxury that guaranteed you got more than you bargained for. Because shipping fragile items across the country resulted in massive breakage, a typical dive bar might only own 3 thick mugs for the entire town. When you paid your hard-earned dime for a shot of cheap whiskey, you drank from a glass that still had the saliva and mustache wax of the previous 50 customers permanently crusted on the rim. The bartender would not even bother wiping it down before pouring the next round, turning every single happy hour into a highly efficient delivery system for the flu. 28. Building a cozy cabin out west sounds incredibly rustic until you remember that real glass windows were an absurdly expensive luxury that had to survive an epic journey before reaching your shack. To save money, many settlers covered window openings with heavy paper or cloth treated with grease or oil to let in a little light while keeping out at least some wind. It was cheap, practical, and about as elegant as wrapping your house in leftovers. Over time, those makeshift windows trapped smoke, grime, and blowing dirt until they looked like somebody had tried to frost the glass with pork. In summer heat, they could turn sticky, saggy, and foul-smelling, giving your home the ambiance of a hot lantern and the personality of a sweating sandwich. 29. Lighting your cabin at night seems incredibly cozy in historical dramas, but real frontier illumination was an absolute assault on your senses. Because beeswax candles were a costly luxury imported from back east, pioneers relied on incredibly cheap tallow candles made from boiled-down animal fat and slaughterhouse scraps. As these cheap sticks burned, they did not smell like romantic firelight. They released a thick, nauseating plume of black smoke that smelled exactly like a rotting carcass. Worse, when the flame went out, the hardened animal fat acted as a dinner bell, attracting hungry rats that would literally chew on your lighting fixtures while you slept. 30. Chewing a piece of preserved meat felt like gnawing on a salty piece of tree bark left out in the sun. Without ice boxes, the only way to keep pork or beef from completely rotting was to pack it in absurd amounts of salt or smoke it until it turned to leather. Cooks would have to boil this rock-hard bacon for hours just to make it physically possible to chew without breaking a jaw. Even after soaking, the meat was so overwhelmingly salty that it would instantly drain every ounce of moisture from your mouth, leaving you desperately thirsty in a town where the water was already full of bugs. 31. Riding shotgun on a stagecoach looks like a thrilling adventure across the open plains, but the passenger cabin was actually a rolling claustrophobic box of absolute misery. A ticket across the territory cost a premium $25, yet it bought you zero personal space. 9 exhausted adults were aggressively crammed knee-to-knee inside a tiny, unventilated wooden carriage for days at a time. Between the violent bumping that caused extreme motion sickness and the total lack of scheduled bathroom breaks, the floor of the coach frequently became a sickening puddle of vomit and human accidents. You paid a small fortune just to sit trapped in a sweltering wooden cage filled with the overwhelming stench of 9 unwashed strangers. 32. Achieving that flawless, wealthy parlor room complexion everyone admired sometimes involved putting ingredients on your face that belonged in a poison cabinet, not a beauty kit. A small tin of premium face powder was a prized luxury, and some 19th century cosmetics contained lead, mercury, or other chemicals that we now know were a spectacularly terrible idea. Women used these powders and creams to create a pale, polished complexion, hide sun damage, or blur the scars left by illnesses like smallpox. And for a while, the effect looked elegant. The problem was that repeated use of harsh beauty products could irritate the skin and contribute to serious health problems over time. So yes, the makeup might make you look refined at dinner while quietly auditioning your nervous system for a disaster. 33. Getting a drink of water from a household barrel required you to actively strain out the swimming wildlife before taking a gulp. Since there was no indoor plumbing, Families kept their daily drinking supply in large wooden casks that sat open in the kitchen or on the porch. These stagnant pools became instant magnets for thirsty rodents, adventurous spiders, and mosquito larvae. You had to use a metal dipper and carefully blow the floating debris away from the edge just to get a relatively clear sip. It was less like drinking fresh water and more like sampling a small, unfiltered pond ecosystem. 34. Building a cozy little homestead out on the plains sounds deeply romantic until you realize that building with real wood cost an absolute fortune. Instead, early town settlers literally cut blocks of dirt and grass to build sod houses. This incredibly cheap construction meant your ceiling was a thriving natural ecosystem. When a heavy prairie rainstorm hit, the dirt roof would turn into thick mud and drip directly onto your dining table. Even worse, the warmth of the stove attracted unhappy snakes, massive spiders, and field mice that would routinely lose their grip and drop right onto your face while you slept in your expensive imported bed. 35. Checking your appearance in a public hotel mirror often involved a grooming tool that should have been declared a public menace. While a personal hairbrush seems like the bare minimum of civilization now, a decent comb made from horn, bone, or other durable material was expensive enough that many drifters and trail hands did not bother carrying one. Cheap boarding houses were happy to solve that problem in the worst possible way by hanging a single communal comb near the lobby mirror for every guest to use. Every dusty traveler, salesman, ranch hand, and lice-friendly prospector dragged those same stubborn teeth through their greasy hair day after day. Then you walked up, fixed your part, and unknowingly volunteered your scalp for whatever tiny hitchhikers had survived the previous shift. 36. Spreading golden butter over a warm piece of cornbread sounds like a delightful pioneer breakfast, but dairy on the frontier was an incredibly risky culinary gamble. Because a reliable icebox was an impossible dream for most settlers, storing fragile dairy products meant leaving them in a dark, slightly cooler dirt cellar. To prevent the costly butter from spoiling completely in the summer heat, cooks heavily salted it and sometimes even buried it underground in wooden boxes. By the time you finally spread a 50-cent slab of this premium spread onto your morning meal, it was practically a fermented, sour paste. It tasted incredibly sharp, smelled faintly of wet soil, and coated your tongue in a thick layer of spoiled grease. 37. Paying your respects at the local graveyard was not always a peaceful stroll among neat rows of carved stone. On the frontier, burial could be rushed, shallow, or improvised simply because proper coffins, labor, and grave digging cost more money than many families had on hand. A sudden death did not politely wait for someone to get financially organized. In poorer settlements, graves might be less secure than anyone wanted to admit, especially after heavy rain or on the edges of town where animals wandered freely. When weather eroded the soil or scavengers started poking around, the results were as awful as you are imagining right now. So even death on the frontier did not always come with dignity. Sometimes it came with a second round of unpleasant community labor. 38. Whenever a cowboy gets winged by a bullet on screen, the doctor calmly wraps the wound in a crisp white bandage like he is starring in an advertisement for modern hygiene. The real medical situation was far uglier. Clean cotton gauze was expensive, supplies ran low fast, and frontier doctors often reused cloths, dressings, and rags far more than anyone today would consider remotely acceptable. Washing methods were basic, water quality was questionable, and the grand medical theory of the day was often just confidence plus a dirty apron. So when you showed up with a fresh farm injury, there was a decent chance the cloth heading toward your wound had already enjoyed a long and disgusting career elsewhere. Frontier medicine was less about sterile care and more about gambling with fabric. 39. Wearing a long dress in town meant acting as a human mop for the endless puddles of chewing tobacco spit. Spitting was a universal pastime, and men casually launched streams of brown juice onto the wooden boardwalks, store floors, and even inside the passenger trains. Women walking in their finest floor-length skirts would unknowingly drag their hems right through these sticky, foul-smelling puddles. by the time a lady returned home from a simple trip to the general store, the bottom 3 inches of her beautiful dress would be heavily crusted with dried tobacco waste, requiring hours of scrubbing with harsh lye soap just to remove the stain. 40. Visiting the outhouse required a bizarre kind of reading material because standard toilet paper was not a thing anyone possessed. Instead, pioneers relied on old mail-order catalogs and almanacs that were nailed directly to the wooden walls of the privy. When nature called, you simply ripped out a page featuring the latest farming equipment or corsets, crumpled it up to make the stiff paper slightly softer, and hoped for the best. The glossy pages of the late 19th century were particularly despised because they smeared rather than cleaned, turning a basic bodily function into a highly frustrating arts and crafts project. 41. Social gatherings were an overwhelming assault on the nose because people tried to cover up their profound lack of bathing with cheap perfumes. Imagine a crowded room where nobody has washed their body in 6 weeks, all sweating heavily in wool clothing near a roaring fireplace. To mask the intense frontier body odor, folks would douse themselves in intensely strong floral scents or bay rum. The result was not a pleasant fragrance, but a dizzying, suffocating cloud of sour sweat fighting a losing battle against cheap lavender water, creating a stench so thick you could practically cut it with a knife. 42. Thinking about a rugged pioneer brewing a fresh pot of coffee over a crackling campfire feels nostalgic, but real frontier coffee was basically hot brown dirt. Authentic coffee beans were a heavily taxed luxury that could cost over $1 a pound, making it a rare treat for a working ranch hand. To stretch their budget, cooks would reuse the exact same coffee grounds for an entire week, eventually mixing in roasted acorns, burnt bread crusts, and sometimes actual soil to keep the color dark. By Friday, pouring a morning cup meant drinking a lukewarm, utterly flavorless mug of gritty sludge that did absolutely nothing to wake you up. 43. You might assume that taking time to scrub your clothes meant you finally smelled fresh, but Frontier Laundry Day was a deeply counterproductive chemical disaster. Store-bought, pleasant-smelling soap was a 20-cent luxury that pioneers absolutely refused to buy when they could make their own for free. However, homemade lye soap was crafted by boiling rancid, leftover animal fat with harsh fireplace ash in a giant iron kettle. The resulting gray paste was so highly acidic, it would literally burn the top layer of your skin right off, and it left your freshly washed clothes smelling intensely like a rotting slaughterhouse. You traded the smell of sweat for the smell of old bacon grease. 44. Sharing a sweet treat with your friends sounds like a charming pioneer childhood memory, but frontier candy habits would make a modern dentist faint. Manufactured chewing gum or hard peppermint drops were an exotic 10-cent luxury that a pioneer child might see once a year at Christmas. Instead, kids actively scavenged chunks of hardened, sticky sap directly off pine and spruce trees to chew on for hours. Because this natural resin was tough to find and incredibly difficult to chew at first, siblings would literally pass the exact same wad of saliva-soaked tree sap back and forth all afternoon. It was a perfectly free, highly efficient way to share every single cold and flu virus in the territory. After hearing all 44 of these realities, the Wild West stops looking like adventure and starts looking like the most unsanitary place a human could survive. But here is the real question. What disgusting reality of frontier life do you think we miss that absolutely belongs on this list? Drop it in the comments. If your answer is nasty enough, it might deserve its own video. And if you enjoy brutally honest history like this, hit like and subscribe.